his available, or what is available. So let's get out to Jeff, because Jeff, we've got the Greek Prime Minister flying out to St. Petersburg. What are you likely to hear in terms of the tone from the Greek Prime Minister?
Karen, I don't know if you're a big Tom Clancy fan, but I know that Steve will know exactly what I'm talking about here. And there is this game of Crazy Ivan going on, isn't there? If you remember your Hunt for the Red October, the Russian sub turns round and then they're going head to head, and it is a standoff, and ultimately it could lead to an accident. And I think that's quite a good metaphor for where we are on this story. And as part of that brinkmanship, you could argue Alexis Tsipras turning up in St. Petersburg on Friday just reminds the other members of the Eurozone and the Brussels contingent what is potentially at stake here. Look, we know the Russians at this point have not come up with any money for the Greeks, but there has been talk about pipeline deals, and there is a friendship here between the two sides, and the Greeks have been very reluctant, I think, to see a rolling over of sanctions against the Russians. But the one voice that struck a chord with me overnight, Karen, as I looked at the maelstrom of noise around this story, was Jens Weidemann stepping in and saying, well, maybe the ECB might find it difficult to provide financial support if ultimately there isn't some progress in the political discussions. One, why is Jens Weidemann saying this? You would expect Mr. Draghi really to be dominating any line from the ECB. But two, I think it's an interesting line of attack because, as we know, the ELA was expanded to give the Greeks a little bit more breathing space yesterday. What is Jens Weidemann saying here? That the ECB may ultimately start to tighten the financing lines as far as the Greeks are concerned, and does he have the authority to do that at this stage? I'll send it back to you on those thoughts. And as far as we know, regardless of how down to the wire this is going, Alexis Tsipras is still scheduled to be here tomorrow afternoon. Back to you.
Yeah, Jeff, let me just pick up on that relationship, if I may, between Russia and Greece as well. We know that Mr. Putin wants a closer relationship with anyone he can get his hands on the fringes of Europe, whether it be Mr. Orban, the Hungarians, whether it be Tsipras and the Greeks. And there's prospects of warm water ports using Greek waters, very tantalising as well, which makes it more political than economic as well. And as you say, and as you and I have pointed out many, many times, the Russians haven't delivered on money for the Cypriots or indeed for the Icelandics, despite vague assurances that there could be some form of accord there as well. The point is, they cannot provide the same kind of money that the ECB, that the IMF, that the European institutions have provided throughout this crisis. At one point or other, they've lent 400 billion euros to the Greeks as well. It's such a cataclysmic economic event that's going on in Greece that Russia, for all its wealth and for all its immense oil wealth, hasn't got the money, has it?
Look, Steve, you've got a mortgage. And you know how the mortgage works. As long as nobody asks you to pay back all of that money in one go, you continue to service your debt with incremental payments. And that's the situation that the Greeks are in at this stage. So the Russians, if they did provide some support, they wouldn't have to come up with 400 billion, nothing like that number. But they could just trickle funds through, and they could ask for something in return for that. I mean, we've talked a lot about the Southern Pipeline and whether there is a deal between the Russians and the Greeks on this alternative pipeline that could see the Russians providing a couple of $2 billion worth of funding, trade funding, shall we call it. And then the Russian railways. The Russian railways have been talking to the Greek railway system for some time now about buying in on the privatization program. So that's an ongoing negotiation as well that could see some temporary funds come in that tide the Greeks over. So there is some room around that.
Jeff, and that's the point, and it's the same as those conversations that the Chinese and the Russians had last year about gas deals as well. You get nothing for nothing in international relationships. The Greeks and the Russians may want a cozier relationship potentially if they're spurned by the Western European lenders, but you've just pointed out the Russian railways will want their pound of flesh. The pipeline will be very costly in some ways to build, and the Greeks will have to obviously pay for those loans, pay for that drip feed of money as well. They'll get nothing out of the Russians that the Russians won't gain from economically, because the Russians will hold the best hand.
Well, I mean, aren't we in the same situation as far as the Eurozone is concerned? You get nothing for nothing. You know, there was supposed to be a mutualisation of liabilities across the Eurozone, but we're now aware that that mutualisation only goes so far. Look, the Greeks borrowed the money. The Greeks are on the hook for the money. They'll have to pay the money back. But where is the willingness to be flexible on the payments through some kind of rescheduling or maybe a new Eurozone debt instrument? It's just not on the table, is it, at this point? So that's why we are where we are today. You get nothing for nothing in this world. And just to point out, Steve, when it comes to the European, or rather the Russian central bank, you ain't getting much stimulus either because we're fighting inflation. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back and we'll play some of my first on interview with Elvira Nabiulina. A very warm welcome, everybody, and welcome back to our position here at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in Russia. I've got a little bit of breaking news to bring you. We have reports that the Russian economy minister, perhaps this is an olive branch to the West as we come up to the rolling over, potentially, the decision that needs to be taken for the rolling over of Western sanctions against Russia. But the economy minister says Russia is unlikely to introduce new sanctions in retaliation for any EU decision, but they will extend the food embargo. That a report coming from RIA at this point, RIA, the news agency. So I want to talk a little bit about where this economy is going. We're looking at contraction at the moment. There is no Anglo-Saxon style stimulus in the pipeline as far as this economy is concerned, despite business here and government wanting to see easier monetary conditions. The head of the Russian central bank says she is not targeting currencies, she is not targeting stimulus, she is very much fixed on inflation. Let's have a listen to what she had to say, and I start off by asking her about some of the domestic speculation that was taking place against the Russian ruble last year and how upset the central bank must have been to see these energy companies in there trading against the bank.
We indeed viewed them as yet another category of market players who were acting legitimately in the currency markets. Although we organized meetings with them and told them about the consequences of the free float regime, because they had to understand that they were taking on the currency risk that the central bank is not going to control the exchange rate. And under the influence of the objective situations, the exchange rate may strengthen or may weaken, and they should be ready for it. And so, for them to be able to control their currency exposure, it would be beneficial to gradually release their currency revenue, and I would say that they have mastered it. And so right now, they are being quite even in terms of selling their currency without any pressure either from the central bank or from the government.
But they say that when it comes to central bankers, quite often they're fighting the last war. So if you think about the Germans, they're always fighting inflation. If you think about the Americans, they're always fighting the depression. In the Russian context, you experienced 98, you've gone through last year. Does that mean you're always fighting ruble instability?
No, it does not mean this. And indeed, until last year, practically the ruble exchange rate, in as far as all of the economic entities were concerned, was a nominal anchor, so to say, something that all of the companies and banks were watching. And that was the responsibility of the central bank. But because we are moving over to the inflationary targeting regime now, the key points to us is our interest rate policy, like the cost of money, the cost of rubles for the economy. And through this interest rate policy, we are influencing inflation. And we want to teach the market players that our interest rate policy is a much more important component. And so, this kind of change of attitude towards our policy is currently taking place. But certainly, the economic entities find it still hard to get used to a floating exchange rate which can change itself either way. But they started paying much more attention right now to our key rate, to our decisions about the key rate that we are taking during the board of directors meetings. This is something that people are really looking forward to. We haven't had that a year and a half ago. I mean, the central bank rate has always been a key discussion point, but the exchange rate was much more important. Now the inflationary targeting will turn the interest rate policies into our main instruments, but we're in the very beginning of our path and the economic entities will have to grow used to it, therefore take some time to reorganize, to change their attitudes towards this policy. That's what we will have to do.
So they're all wrong when they come out like they have done after the latest rate decision and say, this is not about inflation, this is about the ruble once again. What you're saying to me, it seems, is take on board the fact we've now moved to inflation targeting with a floating ruble. The door is now closed. We are not going back to targeting a specific level of the currency.
Well, exactly right. We are not planning on targeting any particular level of currency exchange, and all of our decisions pertaining to the interest rates we are making in order to achieve our inflation target, which in the midterm perspective for us is to reduce inflation down to 4%. Effectively, we are making our decisions analyzing what is going on in the economy and the economic slowdown. We take into account the factor of to what extent it is of a structural or cyclical nature, and respectively we make our decisions. But the kind of policy we are pursuing, I would like to underscore again, we are confident that it would lead to inflation going down to 4%.
And, the funny thing, Stephen, Karen, is, as much as Ms. Nebulina continues to insist that it's an inflation target, not a currency issue, the market continues to believe that it's not true and that the central bank is focused on a level around 50 to 55. But you know what? This is the story everywhere at the moment, isn't it? Nobody believes the Japanese are focused on deflation, that it's about currency. And I wonder, after we saw what Janet Yellen had to say yesterday, whether we should start to suspect that even the Federal Reserve is looking at where the dollar is rather than worrying actually about levels of employment. But I'll send it back to you on that.
Jeff, curious that you bring up both the Americans and the Japanese here, because the missing link has been spending by consumers. How big an issue is the demand story for the Russians as well, for the central bank governor to deal with?
Well, this is the irony here, Karen, and this is what we're going to hear a lot at this International Economic Forum. In the last set of data we saw that was retail related, it has collapsed. I mean, it's terrible. Demand here on the domestic side is really very weak. Companies want stimulus, they want liquidity, they want capital. Even the government came out after the last interest rate decision a couple of days ago and said, we need interest rates to come down more to stimulate commercial lending from the banking sector. So everybody is saying to the central bank here, help us, help us, help us. But the central bank's line continues to be, you know what, if you want to improve the outlook for the economy, deal with the structural issues. It's a bit like the Eurozone conversation. Deal with the structural issues, tackle the reforms, improve productivity, because we're not going to get you out of jail just by moving to an easier monetary policy.
Jeff, you mentioned the government there. How much pressure is Elvira Nabiulina under by the government, by the president as well, to act to stimulate the economy while she's trying to hold the line? And I remember the same conversation last year. She's desperately holding the line, talking about the inflation mandate. Is she under a lot of political pressure?
It's a three-stall story, isn't it? As you know, Steve. The government that runs the economy is saying we need more stimulus, so bring interest rates down. And Mr. Ulyakayev, the economy minister, came out immediately after the 100 basis point decision on Monday and said it should have been more, maybe 150, maybe 200. We need to get below this 11.5% on the policy rate that we're at the moment. But Ms. Nabiulina has a different relationship with the president, and as we understand it, it is a strong relationship. And whilst on the one hand I think the president would like to see growth, she has his confidence. So as long as he is not directly critical of the central bank and critical of her, and he hasn't been since the currency crisis last year, I think she will feel comfortable in pursuing an independent policy that's much more focused on reform and inflation than it is on providing stimulus at the moment. Back to you.
Yeah, excellent, Jeff. And of course, you're at SPIEF, and last year the SPIEF delegates were all saying to us, it's all about the pivot east. We don't need the West. We need investors from the Middle East and China as well. So China, Karen, are they flexing their muscles financially?
A big one on that side today in terms of some of the numbers, Steve, because China attracted more than $9 billion of direct foreign investment in May. That was up nearly 7.8% year on year, according to the country's Ministry of Commerce. The department also reported FDI grew more than 10% in the first 5 months of this year compared to the same time a year ago. Now, the average price of a house in more than 70 Chinese cities staged a turnaround in May.